The Sword of the Fallen. The perimeter of the estate was not merely stone and mortar, it was a necrotic sprawl, the land itself curdled by centuries of Stacy's presence. The air hung heavy with the copper tang of ancient blood and the ozone of lingering dark magic. Sarah led the way, her senses now sharpened to a preternatural degree. Where her friends saw only shadows, she saw the ley lines of the Queen's influence pulsing beneath the floorboards like a diseased circulatory system. They reached the ruins of the gatehouse, a jagged maw of black stone protruding from the earth. It was here, buried beneath a collapsed archway etched with forgotten sigils, that the pull became undeniable. It wasn't a sound, but a vibration, a low, humming frequency that resonated in the marrow of Sarah's new, undead bones. "Wait," Sarah signaled, holding up a hand. Her movements were fluid, lacking the jittery hesitation of her mortal life. She knelt, clearing away a layer of ash and wet, rotted leaves. Christine and Stephanie huddled close, their flashlights cutting through the oppressive gloom. "What is it?" Christine whispered, her voice tight with exhaustion. "We don't have time for this, Sarah. We need to reach the inner keep." "This is the only way we stand a chance," Sarah muttered. She pried at a slab of granite, her vampiric strength manifesting as a cold, dense pressure in her arms. With a groan of stone against stone, the slab shifted, revealing a hollow beneath. Resting in a bed of dry, gray dust lay a sword. It was not ornate. The hilt was wrapped in blackened leather, worn smooth by hands that had turned to dust ages ago. The blade itself appeared to be forged from moonlight trapped in iron, dull, emette, and utterly devoid of reflection. It didn't gleam, it drank the light around it. As Sarah's fingers brushed the hilt, the world tilted. The graveyard shift occurred in an instant. She was no longer in the ruins of England. She was standing on an endless plain of obsidian, the sky a roiling vortex of violet clouds. Before her stood a figure draped in robes of tattered shadow, their face a shifting mosaic of every soul the sword had ever claimed. "You walk among the dead, yet you cling to the pulse of the living," the entity whispered. The voice was a chorus of 1,000 dying breaths, emanating from the blade itself. Sarah felt her heart, or the phantom echo of it, thrumming in her chest. She stood tall, though the pressure of the trial threatened to crush her spirit. "I am not just living, and I am not yet dead. I am the bridge." "You are a vessel for hunger," the entity countered, surging forward. A blade of absolute darkness manifested in its hand, striking towards Sarah's throat. She didn't think, she reacted. Sarah moved with the speed of a predator, catching the blow on her forearm. The impact sent a shockwave of agony through her, cold fire racing along her nerves. She grabbed the hilt of the sword lying at her feet, and the moment her palm closed around it, the blade surged with a blinding, frigid light. The trial was a blur of visceral violence. The entity was not fighting to kill her, it was testing the integrity of her soul. Every strike from the shadowy figure forced Sarah to confront her own monstrous nature. When she swung the sword, she felt the insatiable thirst for blood, the intoxicating lure of the hunt, and the overwhelming desire to let go of her humanity and embrace the darkness. "You are a monster," the shade hissed, locking blades with her. "Why do you fight for those who will eventually fear you?" "Because it's who I am," Sarah spat, her eyes glowing with a faint, predatory amber light. She channeled every ounce of her grief, her guilt over Rachel, and her defiance into the weapon. "I am the one who remembers. I am the one who chooses." She feinted left, the sword carving a white-hot arc through the gloom, and drove the point into the entity's chest. The shadow shattered, dissolving into a fine mist that was absorbed into the blade. Sarah gasped, snapping back to the waking world. She was kneeling in the dirt, her knuckles white around the hilt of the sword. The blade hummed in her hand, a living weight. It felt cold, not the deathly chill of the grave, but the sharp, biting cold of a winter morning that promised a sunrise. She stood up, her breath coming in ragged hitches. "Sarah?" Stephanie stepped back, startled. "Your eyes," they were glowing. Sarah sheathed the sword at her hip, the weapon settling against her leg as if it belonged there. She looked at her friends, really looked at them. She saw the fear, yes, but also the hope. She saw their humanity, fragile and beautiful, and for a terrifying moment, the hunger in her gut roared. She saw the pulse in Christine's neck, the heat radiating from Stephanie's skin. She turned away, burying her face in her hand, forcing the beast back into the cage of her conscience. "I'm fine," Sarah said, her voice gravelly and distant. She took a deep, steadying breath, grounding herself in the smell of the damp earth and the distant scent of the castle's torches. "The weapon is ready." We moved toward the armory. "If we can bypass the main hall, we can cut off the guard's flank." "You look different," Jeff noted, hovering near the rear. He looked at the sword, then at Sarah's steady, iron-set jaw. "What happened in there?" "I learned the cost of this fight," Sarah replied, stepping over the threshold of the gatehouse. She didn't look back. She couldn't afford to. The blade felt heavier now, weighted with the spirits of the trial, but it was a burden she was willing to carry. "And I learned that I am willing to pay it." They moved into the shadows of the outer courtyard. The castle loomed above them, a jagged silhouette of cruelty against the starless sky. Every step took them further from the light, closer to the heart of the machine. Sarah gripped the hilt of the sword, her thumb tracing the worn leather. She wasn't just Sarah anymore. She was the weapon Stacy had unknowingly forged. And she would be the one to break her. The air in the armory was thick, tasting of cold iron and stagnant centuries. The walls were lined with instruments of exquisite, archaic lethality, halberds notched from ancient crusades, rapiers stained with the ghosts of forgotten duels, and heavy, broad-bladed axes that seemed to hum with a low, predatory frequency. Sarah gripped the hilt of the consecrated blade she had claimed in the catacombs. Its metal felt like a live wire against her palm, vibrating with a sanctified heat that burned her vampiric skin even as it bolstered her resolve. Beside her, Stephanie and Jeff kept their backs to hers, their breaths ragged, their eyes darting toward the heavy, iron-bound doors. "They know we're here," Jeff whispered, his voice hitching. "The guards. I can hear them moving in the rafters." "Focus," Sarah commanded, though the red haze of her own hunger flared at the edges of her vision. She could smell them, the copper tang of stale blood and the ozone scent of David's dark magic. The heavy doors groaned inward, not with a crash, but with a slow, deliberate slide. David stepped into the room, his movements fluid, almost feline. Behind him, for members of his elite guard, their skin porcelain pale and eyes glowing with a sickly, ethereal light, fanned out in a practiced formation. "The hero has arrived," David purred, his voice echoing off the vaulted ceiling. He didn't look at Sarah. His gaze was fixed on the blade in her hand. "Do you have any idea what you're holding, little creature? That steel was forged in the fire of an age that has long since forgotten your name. It doesn't just cut flesh, Sarah. It shears the soul from the vessel." "Then it's the perfect tool for you," Sarah shot back, her voice dropping into a register that sounded like grinding stone. David chuckled, a dry, rattling sound. "Kill them. Leave the girl with the blade intact. I want to see if it rejects her or consumes her." The guards lunged. The world shifted into slow motion. Sarah didn't think, she reacted. She pivoted, the consecrated blade carving an arc of blinding white light through the dim room. The first guard, a towering brute of a vampire, threw up an arm to block. The blade didn't just bite into his limb, it cauterized the wound instantly, the magical steel shrieking as it tore through supernatural flesh. Sarah surged forward, her inner monster screaming for the release of a kill. She felt the cold, sharp pull of her vampiric nature, urging her to abandon the sword, to sink her fangs into the nearest throat and drink until the room was silent. She felt the thrum of the blade, its holy intent acting as a tether to her waning humanity. "Don't lose it," she told herself. "Don't become what they want you to be." Stephanie screamed. A guard had bypassed her defense, pinning her against the wall of armor. Jeff tackled him, but the guard backhanded him across the room with a sickening crunch of bone. Jeff! Sarah roared. She channeled the fury of her loss, the memory of Rachel's hollowed-out eyes, into the sword. She lunged at the guard holding Stephanie, driving the tip of the blade through his chest. As the metal pierced him, a shockwave of golden light erupted from the steel, vaporizing the vampire into a cloud of black ash. The recoil slammed into Sarah's arm, numbing her fingers. The bloodlust flared. The scent of the guard's disintegrating essence made her mouth water with a primal, ravenous hunger. She stumbled back, the sword clattering against the stone floor. Her vision bled red. She saw Stephanie, not as a friend, but as a vessel of warm, pulsing life. No. Sarah sank to her knees, clutching her head. Her fangs elongated, scraping against her lip until she tasted her own bitter, tainted blood. David stood a few feet away, watching with a look of clinical fascination, his hands clasped behind his back. The internal war is so much more tedious than the external one, isn't it? David mused, stepping closer. You struggle to hold on to the light, Sarah, but you are already drowning in the dark. That blade is killing you just as surely as it kills them. Every time you strike, you tear a piece of your own soul away. You don't know, Sarah gasped, forcing herself upright. She gripped the sword again. The pain of the holy steel was a jagged anchor, keeping her tethered to the reality of the room. Jeff groaned, dragging himself across the floor toward the weapons rack. He grabbed a heavy iron mace and scrambled to his feet, shielding a trembling Stephanie. The two remaining guards circled Sarah, their movements twitchy and predatory. David gestured with a flick of his wrist, and shadows began to pool around his feet like ink, rising up to form jagged, translucent blades. Enough of this dance, David whispered. He thrust his hand forward. The shadows surged, slamming into Sarah with the force of a battering ram. She was hurled across the room, crashing into a display of antique shields. The consecrated blade skittered across the floor, coming to rest inches from David's polished boots. David reached down, picking up the sword with a gloved hand. He winced as the metal hissed against his skin, a thin wisp of smoke rising from his palm. He sneered, his composure slipping for the first time. A spiteful little toy. He raised the blade to finish her, but Sarah didn't wait. She channeled every ounce of her supernatural speed, launching herself from the pile of armor. She didn't go for the sword, she went for him. She tackled David, her fingers clawing at his throat, her fangs bared. They collided in a flurry of limbs and dark magic. She felt the coldness of his skin, the utter absence of heat in his veins. He was a creature of void and ambition, and as she pinned him to the ground, she felt that same void staring back at her. You think you're a protector? David hissed, his eyes turning entirely black. He shoved her away with a blast of telekinetic force that shattered the stone floor beneath them. You are a contagion. You were born in the same shadow as we were. Sarah rolled, coming to her feet. She was covered in dust and blood, her clothes torn, her heart beating a frantic, rhythmic drum against her ribs. She looked at Jeff and Stephanie, who were cornering the final guard, their faces masks of pure, desperate terror. She looked at David, who was standing over the consecrated blade, his eyes alight with a terrifying, ecstatic malice. The Queen doesn't just want soldiers, David said, his voice dropping to a whisper that seemed to fill the entire castle. She wants successors. And you, Sarah. You have so much potential to be a monster. Sarah felt the hunger rise again, a tidal wave of darkness threatening to swallow her whole. She looked at the blade. She looked at her friends. I'm not a monster, she whispered, her voice steadying even as her hand trembled. I'm the thing that comes for the monsters. She lunged not for the weapon, but for the stone pillar beside David. She drove her fist into the structural support with all the force of her vampiric strength. The stone cracked, spider-webbing outward. The ceiling groaned, dust raining down as the integrity of the room began to fail. Get out, she screamed to Jeff and Stephanie. David looked up, his eyes widening as the ceiling began to buckle. The armory was a tomb, and it was beginning to close. Sarah didn't wait for him to recover. She dove for the sword, grabbing it from the floor. As she made contact, the blade glowed with a blinding, sun-bright intensity, a silent scream of holy fire that sent David reeling back into the shadows. She didn't kill him, she didn't have the time. She turned and ran, the blade acting as a beacon in the collapsing darkness, slicing through the air as she charged toward the exit, her focus narrowing to a single, burning point: find Rachel, and end the Queen's reign, or die trying. The hallway beyond the armory was a labyrinth of shifting tapestries and cold, weeping stone, but the sword served as a compass. Where the shadows thickened, where the air grew dense with the sulfurous residue of Stacy's presence, the blade hummed with a sharp, dissonant note, pulling Sarah toward the heart of the keep. "Sarah, wait." Christine's voice was strained, muffled by the sound of falling masonry behind them. Sarah didn't slow. She vaulted over a collapsed staircase, her movements unnatural, precise, and devoid of the fatigue that clawed at her human companions. She could hear them scrambling to keep pace, the ragged inhalation of Jeff's lungs, the soft, rhythmic thud of Stephanie's boots, but they were fading into the background. She was the tip of the spear. They breached the grand gallery, a chamber so vast the ceiling was lost in a haze of oily, perpetual smog. In the center stood a pedestal, and atop it, a mirror of polished silver that reflected not the room, but a vision of a world choked in ash. "She's close," Sarah whispered. The sword pulsed in her grip, a steady, warm light that fought back the gloom. "How do you know?" Stephanie asked, her voice trembling as she kept her gaze fixed on the shadows near the ceiling. "It all looks the same. It's all a graveyard." "Because I can hear her," Sarah replied, though she knew the answer was incomplete. She didn't hear Rachel with her ears. She felt the phantom tether between their souls, a connection forged in the dark ritual, now frayed and necrotic. It was a cold, pulsing ache in the base of her skull. She's being kept near the inner sanctum. David wasn't just guarding the armory, he was buying time for the initiation. A shadow detached itself from the wall, coalescing into the form of a tall, gaunt figure. It wasn't David. It was the thing that had once been Nick, AJ. The entity stood with an eerie, rhythmic grace, its fingers elongated, twitching with an insatiable, electric energy. "The girl who played with fire," AJ mused, its voice a fractured layering of sounds. "You carry a heavy burden, Sarah. That blade is not merely steel. It is a chronicle of every failure the light has ever suffered." Sarah stepped forward, the sword's light reflecting off the obsidian tiles. "Get out of my way, AJ. I'm not here for you." "The Queen is waiting," AJ whispered, its form flickering like a dying candle. "She is hungry for the rest of your soul. Why fight the inevitable? You were made to serve, not to lead." "I was made to end this," Sarah said. She didn't hesitate. She swung the blade in a wide, punishing arc. AJ vanished, only to reappear behind her, its cold hands reaching for her throat. Sarah dropped into a crouch, the blade whistling through the space where her head had been a millisecond before. She pivoted, driving the hilt into AJ's midsection. The contact triggered a burst of white-hot energy, throwing the entity back against the gallery wall with a sound like shattering glass. "Go," Sarah yelled to the others. "Get to the main dais. I'll handle the distraction. We're not leaving you." Jeff protested, brandishing his mace. "You have to," Sarah insisted, her voice dropping into a snarl that betrayed her waning control. "If I lose my grip, I won't be able to tell the difference between you and them. Run." Terrified by the raw, predatory intensity in her eyes, they broke into a sprint toward the inner doors. AJ gathered itself from the wreckage of the wall, its face distorting into a mask of pure malice. It lunged, not at Sarah, but at the retreating group. Sarah threw herself into its path. The collision was a blur of violence, claws against silvered steel, shadow against light. She fought with a ferocity that bordered on suicide, letting the blade burn her hands as she parried strikes that would have pulverized bone. She was a vessel for the weapon now, her own identity dissolving into the rhythm of the combat. She drove the blade into the floor, creating a circle of sanctified light that forced AJ back. The entity hissed, its form dissolving into the gloom of the ceiling. "You are just the prelude, Sarah," AJ's voice echoed from every direction. "The queen has already begun the harvest. Rachel is merely the first seed." Sarah sprinted toward the inner sanctum, her chest heaving. The heavy oak doors had been torn from their hinges. Inside, the chamber was a cathedral of bone and velvet. At the far end, atop a dais of jagged black glass, stood a throne. And there, kneeling before a figure shrouded in regal, suffocating dark, was Rachel. Rachel looked different. The spirited girl who had once joked about urban legends was gone. Her hair was matted, her skin translucent as parchment, and her eyes, usually vibrant and warm, were now dull, empty pits reflecting the queen's will. She held a dagger of black crystal, poised to plunge it into her own heart as part of the final binding. "Rachel!" Sarah screamed. The figure on the throne, Queen Stacy, turned. Her face was a masterpiece of cold, ageless indifference, her eyes glowing with a hunger that defied time. She didn't move, she simply watched, a faint, amused smile curling her lips. "The late arrival," Stacy said, her voice a silk-wrapped blade. "You bring a relic of the past to challenge the future, little vampire." Sarah leveled the sword at the queen's throat. "Let her go." "She is already mine," Stacy replied, gesturing to the kneeling girl. "She has accepted the gift of eternity. Why would you deny her the peace of the void?" "Because she's my friend," Sarah said, her voice cracking. She surged forward, but an invisible wall of force slammed her backward. She hit the floor hard, the sword skittering away. Stacy rose, her movements fluid and terrifyingly graceful. She drifted toward Sarah, the very air around her chilling to the point of frost. "Friendship is the luxury of the living, Sarah. You have surrendered that right." Stacy raised a hand, and Sarah felt her own limbs turn to lead. She was being pinned to the floor by the sheer weight of the queen's presence. "You want to save her? Then witness her transformation. Watch as the last scrap of her humanity burns away." Rachel stood, the crystal dagger trembling in her grip. Her eyes locked onto Sarah's, and for a fleeting, agonizing second, the vacancy shattered. A flicker of recognition, a memory of a summer night, a laugh, a shared secret, rippled across her face. "Sarah," Rachel whispered. The name sounded like a prayer. "Don't do it, Rachel," Sarah choked out, struggling against the telekinetic pressure. "Look at me. Remember the lake. Remember the house. You don't have to be this." Stacy's smile sharpened. "She is a blank slate. I have written my law into her veins. She's not your toy." Sarah roared. She reached out, not with her hand, but with the tether between them. She channeled every emotion she had suppressed, the grief, the anger, the love, the sheer, unadulterated need to keep her friend from becoming a monster, and pushed it through the connection. Rachel screamed, dropping the dagger. The sound was raw, human, and devastating. She clutched her head, her body convulsing as the queen's influence fought against the surge of Sarah's memory. "Enough," Stacy commanded, her voice vibrating with a power that shattered the stained glass windows of the sanctum. But it was too late. Rachel's eyes cleared, the black film retreating to reveal the familiar brown of her former life. She looked at the queen, then at the fallen sword, and finally at Sarah. "I remember," Rachel whispered. She turned on the queen, not with a weapon, but with a surge of raw, untethered magical energy, the power Stacy had poured into her, now turned against its source. The floor exploded. As the castle began to collapse, stone groaning under the strain of the shifting energies, Sarah scrambled to her feet and grabbed the sword. She lunged for Rachel, trying to pull her away from the dais, but the queen had already unleashed her full fury. A torrent of shadows enveloped them, a vortex of annihilation. "Go, Sarah!" Rachel shouted over the roar of the crumbling architecture. She held her ground, her body glowing with a blinding, ethereal light as she channeled every ounce of the dark magic back into the queen, creating a barrier of pure, sacrificial intent. "Take the others and run." "No." Sarah lunged forward, but the floor gave way, a gaping chasm opening between them. "Live!" Rachel screamed, her voice final. "Finish what we started." With a final, desperate burst of energy, Rachel shoved the queen backward into the center of the collapsing vortex. The roof of the sanctum disintegrated, a rain of stone and fire burying the dais in an avalanche of debris. Sarah watched, frozen in horror, as the abyss swallowed her friend. She wanted to leap into the dark, to die with her, but the blade in her hand pulsed with a frantic, rhythmic warning. The sanctuary was imploding. The entire keep was coming down, the earth itself reacting to the severance of the queen's hold. She turned and ran. She ran through the collapsing halls, dodging falling timber and masonry, her feet pounding against the shaking stone. She burst out into the night air just as the main keep folded in on itself, a massive, thunderous roar that shook the very foundations of the island. She stood at the edge of the ruin, breathing hard, the sword dimming in her hand until it was once again just a piece of dull, matte iron. She looked at the pile of shattered stone that had become Rachel's tomb. Jeff, Christine, and Stephanie emerged from the shadows of the courtyard, bruised and battered, their faces etched with the same shell-shocked grief. They reached her, standing in silence as the dust began to settle. Sarah looked at them. She looked at her own hands, still pale, still marked by the hunger. She was a creature of the night now, a guardian of a threshold they didn't even know existed. The queen might be buried, but the darkness she had unleashed had already begun to bleed into the world. Sarah sheathed the sword. She took a deep breath, tasting the ash, the damp earth, and the distant, metallic promise of a world that needed protecting. "We leave now," she said, her voice cold and absolute. "There is so much more work to do,"